my workshop, which is this room where many things happen, where I tinker and play around with different ideas. It's attached to my office. I've always had a workshop, usually in my home. In the earlier years, in my home. During the late 20s, I was running a plant, a manufacturing plant for a fellow. We were making tire covers, mostly for Ford, and we did a lot of advertising work, silk screen work, and that kind of odds and ends for Chrysler. And the recession came along. It really began in 1929. It was a terrible thing. Bank presidents were jumping out of windows. Everybody, the bottom fell out of everything. There was no money. You had to barter, and it really was a tough go. Soup lines all over the country. And after a year and a half of this, our business was not doing so well. And for some strange reason, it caught fire one night and burned to the ground. And I was out of a job. And there were no jobs. Doesn't make any difference what your talents were. There were no jobs. We had in our business for about a year a nephew of the owner. He'd just gotten out of college, and he came in there in a sales capacity. And he had made a very good friend of the purchasing agent at Chrysler. The guy just loved him, and he could get all kinds of orders. So I got hold of him, and I said, Chuck, why don't we go in business together? Why don't we form a partnership? I know how to make the stuff, and you know how to get the orders. We could, kind of put our thinking together and maybe get going here. Well, he didn't have any money, and I didn't have any money, but I did have some equipment in my basement. I'd been fooling around with archery equipment with bows and arrows. It's where I met Art Young. He came over there. We used to tinker around with bows and whatnot. And I had some equipment, and I said, well, all right, let's take inventory of my equipment and see what it is. So we took inventory and amount to $600, which would be like $5,000 now or something like that. But and then he borrowed $600 from his mother, and we were in business. We rented a big garage, or a pretty good sized garage, and he went over to Chrysler and got some orders, and we got to turn them out. And the archery thing, I'd been making bows and arrows in my basement, and it was kind of a hobby, and we'd formed a little archery club, and we were beginning to get this going, doing a little hunting. I'd met Art Young. He'd come to Detroit. My boss when this place had burned down came to me one day, and he said, Fred, I know you're interested in bow hunting. There's an archer going to give us a demonstration today. A fellow by the name of Art Young. We want to see him. And I said, my gosh, yes, because I'd read his book and saw the film, or read Saxon Pope's book. So I went down there and I met Art Young, and he was in Detroit for 2 years, and we were together real often, and he helped me get started in making bows and arrows, and taught me how to make a bowstring, and we had a lot of fun. Well, my interest in going into business was not really in the field that we were in, tire covers and silk screen work. I was interested in the bows, so I hired a bow maker by the name of Nell Scrumley, who had a reputation in the area for making, whittling out fine bows, and he was a fine artist and did a beautiful job. I hired him, and this archery thing was just a little infant that was off in the corner, kind of being subsidized by the business we were doing with in a regular field. And we grew and grew. We had to move to larger quarters and hire more people, and archery grew just a little bit. I think we hired one more person when we made this move, and things were going real well. I was beginning to promote archery and bow hunting and getting to hunt various other places. And finally, in 1939, we need larger quarters. We had outgrown the second move, and we were outgrowing, and we were doing war work. We were making two things for the B-29 bomber, which was put together finally in Willow Run Airport, just a short ways from where we lived. We were making floorboards with all kind of cutouts on them out of plywood, 1-inch plywood, 4 by 8 feet size, putting rings in where they lashed down cargo and all kinds of things. And one of the other things we made was a gasket, an air seal that was made out of leather that went into the turret to shut the air off so that you could have pressure in the cabins. The turret turned, and this air seal had to be made very, very carefully. We did those two pieces of defense work. Well, in 1939, we were again faced with a move to larger quarters, but the archery by that time had grown to a type of business that could support me. And I didn't especially like the advertising business, and my partner really didn't like the bow business. So I took the archery out of there and moved to a location. We broke the partnership, and that was in 1939. Well, and we did very well there. We had a range, and we were the headquarters of the Detroit Archery Club, and we really did a lot of hunting and a lot of promoting of bow hunting. In 1947, I would always wanted to get out of the big city. I wanted to manufacture, not do a retail business. And I wanted to, I grew up in the woods, grew up in a farm down in Pennsylvania. Never did like a big city. And I was frozen there during the war, and the war ended, I believe, in 45, was it? Well, when I got footloose and where you could move around and there weren't so many restrictions, I went to looking for a location to build a plant and to move the factory. And I'd been spending a lot of time in Grayling, Michigan. A lot of weekends I'd spend up there hunting and fishing. The Sable River right there, and the Manistee River right there, and a lot of clean, clear lakes. And finally, in 1947, I didn't have enough money to build a building and make the move. So I formed a corporation, and my former partner sold his business and bought stock in my company, so we're back together again. And I kept and always had controlling interest in the company. And then a friend of mine from Charlottesville, Virginia, put money in the business, and we made the move to Grayling. And things, of course, were a lot better. The archery bow hunters in Michigan, and we had our first archery season in Michigan, bow hunting archery season in Michigan. In 1937, we had two counties, Newaygo and Ahosco. The DNR people wanted to see that we didn't turn all these archers loose in the whole of Michigan, where they kill all the deer. So they gave us two counties to try us out on, where they could watch us. And the next year was over in we had Newaygo and Ahosco counties, and we hunted the first year in Newaygo, and there were 193 archers who bought licenses to hunt deer in that season. And now we have well over 200,000. Matter of fact, Pennsylvania has more than that. They're climbing close to 300,000. After the war, well, 45, 46, I began looking for a place to build a plant in northern Michigan. And Grayling had been my headquarters for most of my trips when I go north for a weekend or for vacation or go fishing. Good trout fishing and good hunting. And there was and I finally got to a point where I wanted to buy some land to build a plant. And if you wanted to buy some land, in those days, in Grayling, there was no Chamber of Commerce. You had to see a banker, a bachelor banker, who was a Dane, named John Brune. And he had a bank made out of red brick, 2-story thing, and on the front of it, built in letters, Salling Hansen Lumber Company. Inside on the lower floor was the bank, and John ran it. And John didn't run the bank necessarily by the state rules. He was one of the few banks in the whole country that didn't close during the bank holiday and the depression that I told you about. If you wanted to borrow money, it wasn't a question as collateral, it was a question of what he thought of you personally. And if you wanted to buy land, you had to see him because he had come over here in this country from, he was a Danish boy. He came over in this country in the early part of the century, and because he was one of the few people who could read and write, he became the bookkeeper and the secretary for the Salling Hansen Lumber Company. And with the original Salling Hansen people long since gone, he became the secretary of, he took care of all the estate. He became the executor, he was the executor of the estate of the Salling Hansen Lumber Company. And if you wanted to buy some land, you had to see him because he's had it all. Well, I made my acquaintance with John. I'd known him, having met him there for a few times, and I go to race up to Grayling from Detroit, a couple hundred miles, in late Friday evening, and fish or hunt Friday and part of Sunday, and try to get an early start back home Sunday evening to beat the traffic back to Detroit. And so I finally got a date with John, 11 o'clock one Sunday morning. And over top of the bank, he had an apartment, a bachelor apartment, and it was really something. And I had a date to meet him up in his apartment at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And I thought, well, gee, that's great. I can look over some property. We can buy a piece of land to build a factory on, and I get an early start back home and get Detroit ahead of the traffic. Well, I went up to see John, and he was drinking scotch to come out of the one from the night before. And I am not much of a drinking man. I can't drink very much, but I guess I thought I could that day. And we had a few drinks, and about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, John wondered if maybe we should go across the street to Dad Hansen's sandwich shop and have a sandwich. Well, we did that, and we'd finished our sandwich, and John had a couple of, he was in the Russian Cossack army, and he had a couple of pretty spirited horses in the stable back of the bank. And he said to me, would you like to go for a horseback ride? Well, I thought that was the best thing that ever could happen, because I spent 3 years in the U.S. Horse Cavalry, and so we went across the street, saddled the horses up, and we wound up out 2 miles out of town at Lake Marguerite, where a friend of his, we stopped and visited a friend of his. We tied the horses to trees on his lawn, and the unfortunate part of that one is this friend had a bottle. And I don't know whether we left voluntarily or whether we were asked to leave or thrown out, but it was about midnight. And we crawled on our horses. I remember we rode through the lake there a little bit. I got my feet wet riding in the lake. And then we struck straight across country through the scrub oaks and jack pines on the dead run. John was leading. I just laid down over the horse's neck to keep the rocks and branches out of my eyes. And miraculously, we got back to town. Well, John was a very meticulous person. We had the saddle went on that peg, and the bridle went on that peg. They had to be cleaned. The horses had to be rubbed down. And finally, all this work is done, and it's so dark, and I am feeling terrible. I just felt awful. almost hoping I'd die, I guess. And I thought, well, you know, we'll have to try this another time. We've wasted the whole day. Well, we walked out in front of from the stable out in front of the bank. And John says, well, let's look at the property. Well, you know, you don't look at property in the middle of the night when you can't see it. And I thought of that, and I wanted to just go to the hotel there and go to bed. But I had to stay with him, or I thought I had to, and I said, well, all right. So we got in his car, and we drove out to where the factory finally turned out to be. He parked the car, pulled off the side of the road and parked the car, and he said, how's that look to you? Well, all I could see was the tops of the trees against the sky, but I knew that it was pretty good property. I think to remember, the Saba River was on the backside of it, and the main highway going west from Grayling was where we were parked, and we're talking about 300 or 400 feet, as I remember. I said, well, it looks all right. Well, he said, what's it worth to you? And I said, well, I don't know. What do you want for it? And he said, it's $1,500. And I said, well, that's all right. That sounds okay. I'm wanting to go to bed. I'd have bought the Brooklyn Bridge or sold it. And he said, well, okay, you can have it for 12. And that didn't make any sense, but I said, okay, we got a deal. And I went to the hotel room, and I slept or woke up with a headache, and I thought, oh my God, I've had a terrible time. We've messed the whole weekend up. He was not in the condition to write a contract, or I wasn't in condition to buy anything, but I went back to Detroit, and I got a letter 2 days later confirming the whole thing, and that's how the plant property was bought in Grayling, Michigan. The reason for our move to Grayling, I kept telling myself, was to get away from retail business. Mostly we just wanted to manufacture, and we had a fine plant here to start off in. We were only doing about $100,000 worth of business in Detroit, and that was the situation when we moved into Grayling. We had about 15 of our old employees who came along with us, and it was a real happy situation. We were I was in the land that I liked, you might say, on beautiful trout streams with woods, and really I'd never gotten into the archery business to make money. I got into the archery business because I liked that kind of business, and it sprang from a hobby in my basement or in my garage or wherever, and I just loved it. So here we are in Grayling, and going merrily along. But as usual, when you make plans, or at least the plans that I made, were not very accurately. The building cost more, the moving cost more, and we had some real tough going in those very early days. As a matter of fact, I spent 2 long summers from early spring till late fall until November. I had 40 acres out on the Manistee River, which is 7 miles from town. And I put a tent cabin combination up on that. I had a 16 by 20 tent, and I put a floor down, 2x4s and plywood, and a framing around with doors and windows and the whole thing. Pulled the tent down over the plywood sides up 4 feet, and we did a lot of living right on a trout stream. We lived pretty much on berries and trout that we'd catch, and we really had a ball. Actually, I took a new bride into this tent cabin affair that I have out in the Manistee, and it was real great. We entertained company there. I had no telephone, of course. We're out in the woods, 7 miles from town, and I'd take company out, business company many times. W.B. Westcott was one of our favorites who'd come and visit us. I'd blow the horn when a quarter of a mile from the tent, which is the only warning Mrs. Bear had to that we're going to have company for lunch or for dinner or whatever it would be. But it worked out great, and it saved us some money. We were able to come out of our doldrums much quicker because of that. And I was continuing to do promotional work. I began to make films of bow hunting. In the early 40s, I made a film, a deer hunting film, with Jack Van Covering, who was the outdoor writer for the Detroit Free Press. And it's very interesting, and I watched as carefully as could, and we came up with a pretty good film on the thing. But I learned a lot, and finally I got myself into the filmmaking business. I bought Jack's the camera that we had used on this trip, and did some experiment, and went up into Canada and made a film of a friend of mine we called Jim's First Moose, and it turned out pretty good. And all at once I found myself up to my neck in the film business, and it wasn't like the video of today. You took the film, ran through the camera, and hoped that when the hunt was over, the camera was working, and then you edited the thing and put a soundtrack on it and did the whole thing. It took a lot of doing. In 1952, I started to hunt antelope. I guess probably I was the first person to hunt antelope with a bow and arrow. Went out to Wyoming with my camera and equipment, and made a film on that. In 1955, I went and made my first trip to Africa, and that was very interesting. There's a lot you can learn, as in many cases, you make a trip to a new territory, and about all you do is find out what you should do the next time you go. And that's the way those things work out. Each time you learn something that helps you on the next trip. The African trip in '55 was, I had a photographer with me. I had a paid photographer, Robert Halmy, from New York, who has since grown into fame for his television work. He was my photographer, and I kept doing this, kept going different places to hunt, and finally I found myself in a position where I could go any place. After I got the company going, after we got on a money-making basis and had a few dollars, I found myself in a position where I could go hunting any place in the world, take some pictures, write a story, make a film, and I could not only expense it out, but I could pay myself for doing it. And I've been doing that for 40 years now, and just having the ball. I made many trips in '57 up to British Columbia, shot a very beautiful stone sheep, went to Alaska, got a Dall sheep and some other animals, moose, caribou, and whatnot. And every year I was on the go, and usually for a different kind of game, and usually making a film. And it was quite a chore. In the days before I could have a paid photographer, I had to do everything. I shot still pictures, both black and white and color, and also shot film. And I did the hunting. And you can be pretty busy doing that, but I was doing something that I liked, and it just worked out great. In the early '60s, I learned of a group of rather important people who gathered at a place near Rose City to hunt deer with guns. That was in the gun season, which is the last 2 weeks in November. I had a friend in Rose City, and I called him up, and I said, Basil Hughes, he worked for the Department of Conservation. I said, Basil, do you know Bill Boyer, who has this grouse haven property over in your town? And he said, yes. And I said, well, I would like to go over there when that gang are assembled there. Could you get me an invitation? He said, well, yeah, let me see what I can do. So he talked to Bill Boyer, who owned the place, the General Motors vice president, who had put the General Motors air transport together back in the beginning, and he invited me over, and I went over there. And my golly, I really had a great time. Arthur Godfrey was there, General LeMay, General Hank Everest, Dick Botel, Fairchild Aircraft, Larry Bell, Bell Helicopter, all the big people in the flying world were there. And I got them to shoot the bow and arrow, and I made a little hay with them. And as a result of that contact, I was on Arthur Godfrey's television show for 3 or 4 times. I was on the Tonight Show at one time, and I got a great exposure on Arthur Godfrey's radio television, and it was the greatest promotional operation that I had ever done. We went to, I invited Arthur Godfrey and Peter Barrett, who was the editor of True magazine at that time, to go on a hunt with me in Mozambique in 1964. And I got more publicity out of the thing. And later, I went again in 1965, and the whole thing just tied up into a ball of promotion. I think that it really was a tremendous boost, not only for the Bear Archery Company, but for bow hunting in general. Things really got better from time to time. The progress was rather slow. We had many setbacks. At one time, the bow with the aluminum limbs cut into our market deeply. We had to, Ross Saragosa, who was president of Admiral Radio at that time, was a hunting friend of mine, and I finagled some work from him in terms of making television cabinets, and we did that and the other thing, but things did improve. The original plant was 8,000 feet, and as things got better, we would add some manufacturing footage, and we kept adding over the year. Every couple of years, we'd add something. Every couple of years, our business would grow and multiplied many, many, many times. Finally, we wound up with 120,000 feet of manufacturing space, which was actually, it was bigger than I wanted it to be. When I moved up there from Detroit to Grayling, I just wanted to do a couple $100,000 worth of business and have time to do some hunting and fishing. Well, it didn't work out that way. The thing sort of got out of control. I was over promoting, or I don't know I guess there was quite a demand that was created because it was not only our company that grew, but it seemed like I was doing the promotion for all of the archery industry. And it grew like Topsy, until finally it got sort of out of control and much, much bigger than I wanted it to be. But anyhow, we found ourselves back in the business of making bows and arrows in this plant in Grayling, which had been all chopped up, add a piece here, add a piece there, add a piece there. And it wasn't until we finally moved out of there to where we are now in Gainesville, Florida. And it was certainly a pleasure to design a plant. The operations that needed to be produced there, based on production lines and that kind of thing, and vacate the piece-by-piece thing that we had put together in Grayling.
How come you didn't want the operation to get that big? What's wrong with it?
Well, what the hell? It's more work. A couple $100,000, you know. You can run it easy, and you can run it easy, and I got more time to have fun. Mm-hmm. My God, I did more fishing around Grayling when I lived in Detroit than I did after I got up there and got busy running this big thing.
So you didn't actually run the plant day to day?
Oh no, I never ran the plant. No, I never did that. I always hired people to do that. I did the promotional work and I did the design work. I designed the equipment. That was my job, yeah. I'm sort of a layman engineer, a methods man, you might say, or whatever you call it. I don't know. But I did those things, and I designed equipment. There were many things that happened. I remember we got back behind in our payments one time, and in Grayling, and this was about 1950, when we were in that business of coming out of the move and getting going, getting sales up. We owed the Internal Revenue $8,000, and we didn't have any money. And it became overdue, long overdue, and they sent their man from Alpena, which is 80 miles away, and they came in there one day with a state policeman and a lock, a padlock. They're going to lock the place up. And my partner, well, he wasn't my partner, it was a corporation, I was the president, but the fellow that had been my partner before we got in the archery business, he came out to the engineering room where I was working on some plans for a TV cabinet, making some toolings for it. And He said, Fred, looks like we've had it. He said, this IRS man here, if we don't pay up, they're going to lock the place up and we're in bankruptcy. What are we going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing, and you're going back in there and selling them a bill of goods. And I don't care how you do it. Well, he went back, and he did a pretty good selling job. He made a deal with them. He wrote them a check for $500 and promised to pay $500 a month until it was all paid up. Well, we didn't have $500 in the bank, so I had met a fellow, Franklin Hills, who lived down the river. He was a paraplegic. And I'd met him just twice. And I liked the fellow. And I went down and see him, and I said, Franklin, I need $500 for 30 days. And he said, Mildred, hand me my checkbook. Well, we got out of that one, and that was a real tight one. And we had a few other ones that were tight like that, but we worked real hard. We put in long hours, and we, took care of the business, and everything worked out great. And that's a good cue. Most people, when they make, or many people I should say, when they make the hobby of their business, it becomes a chore. But archery is a different kind of business, and it's never become a chore to me, and I just love being in it.
Doesn't sound like you ever work too hard.
I put in long hours. In Detroit, I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning in the wintertime to go down and get the place warm enough for the employees to come in and start work at 7. And I stayed there late at 9, 10 o'clock at night. Lots and lots and lots of nights. Yeah, and to anybody who wants to get into their own business, just remember this. Anybody can get into business, but how do you get out? You don't. And it's a hard lick. And unless you're prepared to put in some long hours, or are a lot smarter than I was, you better stay out of it.
So what kind of things would you do when you were there for 15 hours?
Well, I fired the place up, as for one thing. We had a furnace in the basement, a coal-fired furnace. And yeah, sure, I shoveled coal in the furnace and got the place warm. And there's a story that goes along with that furnace business. I was fishing up near St. Helen at one time. I was fishing for bass in the spring of the year when they were on the bed spawning. And that's the time of the year when the turtles crawl out on the sand on the banks and lay their eggs. And these were snapping turtles. And I thought, I had a friend who ran a restaurant in Monroe, Michigan, sort of a seafood, wild game restaurant. And I thought, gee, he'd love to have these turtles. So I put 6 or 8 up. You can pick them up with your tail, and put them in a gunny sack. And in my car there, I put 6 or 8 or 10 of them, I don't remember how many, in my trunk of my car. And I started home. And I had a flat tire. I had turtles all over the highway before I got the flat tire fixed. But I finally got home with them, and I called up Frank Malicki was his name, and I called him up, and I said, Frank, hey, I got a little prize for you. I got a whole bunch of snapping turtles. He said, we don't serve snapping turtles. Well, there I am stuck in Detroit with 8 or 10 snapping turtles. And what do you do with 8 or 10 snapping turtles that you don't want in Detroit? Well, this basement was just a little basement that held the furnace. I put them there. And then we had a hose there to wash the thing down. And I turned the hose on, and they laid eggs all over my basement. And in the meantime, everybody's coming into the store. I said, would you like to have some turtles? And nobody wanted to have any turtles until my brother-in-law came in. And I said, Glenn, you know anybody that would like some turtles, some snapping turtles? Well, he said, I got a friend that just loved them. And I said, any friend of yours is a friend of mine. You tell him, come and get them, will you? And so he came and got the turtles, and that was the end of that story. He bailed me out. But this friend of his said that one of his favorite pastimes, he had another fellow, put on dirty clothes, and they go wading muddy ditches in the spring of the year and reaching up under the bank for turtles. And that's a friend. He had V-shaped marked all over his arm where the turtles had bitten him. Anyhow, that's my turtle story.
And nubs for his fingers?
Yes. Okay.
Well, what else would you do when you got there? You fired up the furnace, and then what would your day be like?
Well, I had all kinds of days. Good days, bad days, whatnot. I never knew what I was going to do. except that I had projects. I had a bow maker at that time, Nelson Grumley. I guess he's probably the best bow maker in the whole country at that time. When you made bows out of wood, they weren't laminated bows. We had no fiberglass. You had to be an artist to know how to work with a piece of wood that you had to make the bow out. And oh yeah, people come in to work. We did a lot of sewing machine work. We made leather goods, as I told you before. I knew something about working leather when I worked before I went in the archery business. We made golf bags. That was one of the projects, and I learned to work with leather. We made leather quivers and arm guards and gloves for the archery industry. That really was the first thing that got us into the business. So we had some sewing machines there, and have to make sure all the workers have something to work, that the girls have some things to sew on, that the cutter has his work scheduled. And I did the billing and the selling and the correspondence and everything. So there's lots of things to do when you're starting a small business. Yeah. One of the developments that happened in Grayling was there was a need for a broadhead, an arrowhead for hunting, and I had developed one. We called it the razorhead. One of the problems in producing the razorhead was to design a machine that would do it more or less semi-automatically. And we put our heads together and cooked up some ideas and did some testing and trying out and whatnot. The test for the razorhead was that it would stand a shot from a 65-pound bow into a cinder block. Now, cinder block is like a cement block. Instead of making a cement block out of sand, a cinder block was made out of cinder, not quite as hard, tough but not quite as hard. And the breakdown test was would it stand up being shot into that. And the reason that was chosen is because that was the wall of the building that was in the tool room where we worked, where we did this testing. The razorhead turned out to be a winner. We made millions of the things. We made this machine that had 12 stations to produce it, and had a grinding equipment to sharpen it up, and it was really quite a step in the right direction. Well, even in Detroit, we had a showroom there where we would exhibit trophies, deer heads and skins and whatnot. And as I hunted more, I collected more of these kind of things, and we put them up in our reception room, in the office reception room in our factory in Grayling. I kept on hunting, and I began hunting larger animals, and the reception room was enlarged several times, and finally we had, even on the ceiling, we had animals and skins and whatnot. And I kept on hunting and kept getting larger and larger animals, some of them a full mount, which were put in storage. And I always kind of looked forward to a time when a museum would be justified, a museum to put these artifacts in. And that occurred in Grayling in 1967. We built a special building, very beautiful building, and opened the museum. And we never expected it to be a moneymaker, and we expected it would cost us money, but we could use it as promotion, bear archery and general bow hunting promotion. And lo and behold, from the day the doors opened, it paid its own way and actually paid us a little profit. And we did in those years put about 100,000 people a year through the Fred Bear Museum, which was 2 miles out of town in Grayling, Michigan, which is on the upper end of I-75. We're now at the other end of I-75, here in Gainesville, Florida. We have the museum here. The museum is a very interesting operation. I'm a collector, I'm a scrounger or a gatherer or whatever you call them, and I've been all over the world and I picked up a lot of oddities. It's not just a building full of dead animals. Actually, it's a lesson in natural history. It's good for the kids, young kids, old kids, big kids. I have, for instance, I was hunting polar bears in Point Barrow, Alaska, and I saw on the roof of an Eskimo's hut a kayak, a real, genuine Eskimo kayak. The frame they made out of a baleen, which is a bone that grows in the mouth of the whale, used to be used for corset stays way back. And they had it covered with seal skin, this skins from the big seal, the ugrit, the biggest seal that there is. And I looked the owner up and I said, that kayak you have on the roof of your house, is that for sale? Eskimo are great people. They're honest. You can leave your door unlocked, nothing happened. They're happy people. And he said, how much were you thinking of paying? And I said, I was thinking of $100. Well, he said, I'm thinking of $150. And that was the total transaction. Neither one of us said a word more. I had the money in my pocket, and I paid him and put a tag on it and went down the airline and shipped it to the museum where it is here. We have all kinds of things. We have mastodon tusks that are just hundreds of thousands of years old, came out of hydraulic mining from Alaska. We have just all kinds of things, buffalo skins, and there's no end to it. And it's great for school children. They come here by the busload. Almost every day there's a busload of school children going through, and they all just love it. They have a ball. So when you're down this way, you stop in and have a look at the museum. You can also see what's going on in the plant, see how we make bows and arrows, and you'll have a great time.